On this episode of Square Repair, we crack open our free 5.3 engine and get it rotating freely once again. We also prep the engine to mate up to our SM465 transmission as we prepare to drop it into our 1987 Suburban. Later on, I show you what you need to look out for when prepping your own engine for a swap. All this and more coming up on Square Repair. The square body Chevy, the iconic, hard-working truck from the 70s and 80s. These trucks were built to endure the toughest jobs America had to throw at them. This is the show where we take these beasts that were once the heartbeat of America and bring new life into them to last for decades to come. My name is Jovani Dante Griego, and this is Square Repair. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Square Repair. I'm your host, Jovani Dante Griego. In the last episode, you saw us rip out that old 6.2 diesel out of our big white Suburban. And in today's episode, we're gonna be tearing apart this 5.3 liter junkyard engine that we've had sitting around the shop for a while. We're gonna go through it, change out all the gaskets that need changed, make sure everything's all good, slap it all back together, and drop it in our Suburban. Now, as you can tell, I'm doing this out of a dirty home shop. Most guys, if you wanted to do this right, they would send it off to a machine shop, wait the 5, 6, 7 months for it to come back, have the machine shop basically do everything. After a couple hundred, maybe $1,000, they would have a fresh 5.3. Now, more power to you if you're gonna do it that way, but I'm just here to show you guys that this can all be done in your home shop. Now, a long time ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, I had already gone through this engine, so everything should be relatively unchanged. I've been using this engine mostly as a mock-up for some other projects, such as this 54 Chevy pickup right next to me. So it's been sitting around for a while. Unfortunately, I think it did sit around without any oil in the pan, or obviously no oil circulating through the engine. So right now, everything seems to be a little stuck. So mostly we're just gonna rip everything apart, get everything nice and lubed up, and then throw it back together again with new gaskets. Now, if we come across any problems with the engine, we'll be able to see that right away and address it at that point. Now, in addition to running through the engine, we're also going to mount up all of our manual transmission components, such as our flywheel and our clutch. That way, when we get back to the Suburban, it's a nice, easy drop in. All we have to do is slide that input shaft into the engine and everything should bolt up nice and clean. Now, I think one of the most interesting parts of this build is definitely going to be converting this guy to accept that SM365 4-speed transmission we got in the Suburban. Those transmissions were long gone when the LS engine came out, so there's a couple things we're gonna have to convert, a couple things we're gonna have to do in order to get that to mate up nicely. Luckily for us, all those parts are OEM GM parts and they're all relatively cheap to come by, so that was only a couple $100 extra in this build. So let's go ahead and get started on tearing this thing apart, laying everything out, making sure everything is still functioning the way I want it to, and get this thing rolling smooth once again. All right, and the first step of this is just removing this intake. It's just 8mm bolts around the perimeter of the intake. All right, then we're just gonna move anything out of the way. On this one, there is a knock sensor harness on top of it that just clips on. We'll remove that, and then we'll simply just lift off the intake. And now that we've got our intake off, you can see how kind of crusty and grimy everything is. I'm gonna take a second to just spray some degreaser on this, wipe everything down, make it nice and clean again. Now, there's a couple of decisions you're gonna have to make when you're going through these LS engines. This one is a Gen 3, meaning it has our cathedral port heads. It also has these knock sensors right in the center valley. What I like about Gen 3 engines is that you don't have to worry about DOD or AFM, which is active fuel management. That didn't come until the Gen 4 engines after about 2007. So really, this is just a push rod roller motor at the end of the day. Now, going back to those decisions you're gonna have to make, a lot of people will just go ahead and buy a knock sensor delete valley cover. I personally, if the knock sensors are working, I'll run them. There's nothing wrong with running them. You can think of it as an early warning detection system. When you're tuning, you really shouldn't be seeing any knock on your engine if you're tuning it NA like we are, but it's always a nice thing to have. I don't mind them, I'll just keep them in there. Now, obviously at this point, it would also be good to throw in any performance parts that you're gonna be using, like a camshaft, going through pistons and all that. I prefer to just keep these things stock just to get the car running and moving, because although it might be easier to do whatever we need right now, that's obviously gonna add to our budget and that's gonna add to the time it's gonna take to finish this project. Now my philosophy is, if we can just get that car running and driving, we'll figure out anything it might need later on. Although it might take more time and labor after the fact to throw a cam in here or whatever, it's less time ultimately that car will just be sitting waiting on a camshaft to go in this engine. I'm a firm believer in just making things run and drive first and then upgrading them later. Now enough of that chit chat, let's go ahead and get these valve covers off so we can see the valve train. Again, just like our intake, these are 8mm bolts and there's 8 of them. Now that we have our valve covers off, we can see that everything in here is just a little bit grimy. And don't worry, I'm gonna bring you guys in closer in a little bit here once we get to the actual nitty gritty. We're gonna go ahead and remove just our rocker arm assemblies, put them on the bench, and then go ahead and remove these heads so we can see the tops of the pistons. And once again, we're gonna use an 8mm socket to remove the rockers. Once all of the rocker bolts are removed, the whole thing will come out as an assembly. We'll take our rocker assembly, put it on the bench, and just remember which one goes right and left. All right, now that we have the rocker assembly off, we can remove our push rods. We'll take all of these and try to keep them in the same orientation, and then we'll go ahead and roll them on the bench just to make sure that they're all straight, and then we'll inspect them to make sure there's no undue wear. All right, and then with that part done, we're able to go ahead and take off the cylinder heads now. The cylinder heads are held on by 5 10mm bolts on the top half, and then about 10 13mm bolts hold the head on in the middle and on the sides. And by 13mm bolts, I meant 15. These bolts are usually on there pretty good. They're torqued about 65 foot-pounds. So it might take quite a bit to get them loose. Now really fast, I want to go over what a lot of people have some trouble with when you're first getting into this kind of LS world. Technically, the 5.3s, 4.8s, and the 6.0s, they fall under the Vortec truck motor category. But for the sake of, simplicity, we're going to lump everything into the LS category. Ultimately, especially the Gen 3 engines, these things are almost identical to the LS1, LS2 style engines. Now, one thing a lot of people get hung up on, or they have an issue with, is when they're buying these, you can notice here, and I don't know how well you guys can see that, but this says 4.8/5.3 liter. Now, like I said, these blocks, especially the 4.8 and 5.3 liter engines, are basically identical. Almost all internal components are the same, external components are the same. You really would have a hard time telling the difference between a 4.8 and a 5.3. Now, really the only way that I've ever really been able to distinguish the two would be to look at the pistons. If you look at this piston, you could see it is a dished piston, meaning that this engine is in fact a 5.3 liter. The only difference between a 5.3 and a 4.8 is in the crank itself, the crank and rods. Not even the rods, just the crank. The cranks are different because that 4.8 has a shorter stroke than the 5.3, meaning that it could use that flat top piston. So if you see a flat top piston in the engine, it's gonna be a 4.8. If you see a dished piston, it's gonna be a 5.3 unless someone has gone through and changed that. Now really though, unless you're paying a premium for 5.3 liter engines, which you shouldn't be, there really isn't that much of a power difference between a 4.8 and a 5.3. Obviously, there's a little bit of displacement, but nothing really that's gonna make or break the build. I, for one, usually prefer the 4.8 engines because I can have them cheaper and they seem to hold up a little bit better to boost. Now this engine's gonna stay NA for a while, so none of that really matters. Like I said, if you're gonna pay the premium, make sure you have a 5.3 liter engine. And if you're going out to go see the engine, it might be a good idea to buy one of these less expensive bore scopes, and I'll have a link to this one down in the description below. But you know, you could use one of these, pop it in the spark plug hole, see the top of the piston, and know what you're buying without having to take apart the engine. Okay, so off camera, you didn't miss much, but what I did do is I went ahead and lubed up these cylinders with a little bit of PB Blaster and a little bit of just conventional motor oil. And then I kind of just gave it a little bit of persuasion here. And as you can see, now everything rotates freely. So I'm gonna actually leave that motor oil and PB Blaster kind of in the cylinder walls just as like a fog, just so this doesn't rust up by the time we get it back in the Suburban. Now, in addition to that, what I was working on now is before we roll this thing over and start working on the underbelly, we're gonna just take out these lifter trays right here. And we're just gonna inspect the roller lifters. Now, everything here is a little bit dirty, so I've been just going through and cleaning everything out with a paper towel. That way we can avoid any of that stuff falling into the engine. Then what we do is we just pull out each one of these lifters with a long pair of pliers. You can see this one has some crud on it, so we're just gonna wipe that all off, get everything nice and smooth again, and then we're gonna actually inspect that roller lifter. See, that one had some schmoo on it, but overall these things still had a little bit of oil on them, so they look fine. Then what I'm doing is I'm just grabbing some lifter assembly lube and just dropping a drop on there, just so by the time we get this engine back in the truck, there's still a little bit of lube on the lifters themselves and they don't run dry. We then take that lifter and we stick it into the lifter tray, and we're kind of testing for fit of the lifter tray here. You can see this one is a little bit loose. We want a snug fit, but overall that's going to be okay. Now obviously you can replace parts as you see needed. Lifter trays are an inexpensive item that will save you a lot of money down the road if your lifter trays do give out and wear out your lifters. Now, being that the LS engines are roller motors, you generally don't see a lot of lifter issues in the Gen 3 engines. You will find lifter issues on the Gen 4 engines and in the engines containing AFM. Now that the tray is complete, we're just gonna stick all of our lifters in. I like to just make sure that all the little spray nozzles are all pointing the same way. Now, I don't think that matters, but that's just something I do. And then we'll just stick the tray back in the way the lifters came. Before we do that though, I am gonna just give this lifter bore one more kind of wipe with a paper towel, get anything out of there that shouldn't be in there. All right, and then we'll just drop this thing in. Nothing should fight you on your way in. Everything should just kind of drop in with a little bit of resistance, but not too much to where you're having to force anything on. And then these just get snugged on there. So I'm gonna do that to the other side, and then we'll go ahead and rotate this engine over and take a look at the oil pan. All right, so as you can see, we haven't really done anything crazy. We just turned the engine over. We took off our oil pan and our windage tray. Now, the reason I'm doing this, you guys necessarily don't have to do this, but I'm doing this because we had an oil pan that was kind of drilled and tapped for like a turbo setup, and I'm just trying to run a stock oil pan on this. So I have the stock oil pan, I'll go grab that, but we're gonna put the stock windage tray back on, and then most importantly, we're gonna put the stock oil pickup tube back on, because this hot rod pan or whatever I had on there before is probably gonna have a different length pickup tube, and leaving that on here would probably result in it not being able to suck up enough oil, because the stock 5.3 oil pans are way deeper than this one is. So anyway, we'll slap that on here, get that all on there, and then we'll start putting our gaskets on. So we've got pickup tube O-ring, oil pan gasket, oil filter block off plate gasket, and all that stuff. So we'll be right back and we'll get those things on there. Alrighty, so with the camera off, we took off the oil pan, took off the old windage tray, took off the pickup tube. We installed a new O-ring on our pickup tube, put in this stock windage tray. We have our stock pan right there ready to go. And then we went ahead and just painted our timing cover black because I wanted to. And we installed a new front main seal on here. So that should button up everything on the front. But what I like to do is before we put our pan on and everything, I like to actually just keep our timing cover kind of loose. That way we can snug these bolts down flush with the pan, and then drop the pan on, pan gasket, all that good stuff. So we'll do that, and then it's time to just basically start reassembling this engine and throwing all new gaskets in as we're doing that. Okay, so for some reason I didn't get audio on these clips, but as you can see here, what these are just new MLS head gaskets. These are the ones that come in the kit. Typically, I prefer just using, stock MLS head gaskets, but these things have definitely gotten better as time has gone by. So I don't mind running these. Do not use like those Felpro blue gaskets or really any of the other gaskets that aren't multi-layer steel. That's what MLS stands for. And other than that, there's just my son kind of cleaning up things as I go, and we're just gonna slap this thing back together. All right, so what you just saw there was something a little bit controversial, and you probably didn't even realize it. We just reused our stock head bolts, and I know I'm gonna get a ton of heat in the comments for that. I don't really care. I've always reused my stock head bolts. There's guys that are running 10, 15, 20 pounds of boost that are reusing stock head bolts, and there's data backing the fact that stock reused head bolts are oftentimes stronger than cheap Chinese head studs. So with that being said, we still need to torque them down. The original factory bolts are torqued to yield the first time you go around them. We can't do that anymore because they're already stretched. So what I typically do is I'll run them all down to about 55 foot-pounds. And if that feels comfortable, then we'll go ahead and crank them up to about 60. We're aiming for about 62 to 65, but don't over torque them. They've already been pre-stretched, so they are a little bit more fragile than they normally would. We're gonna do that. I'm not even really gonna show you guys that. I'm just gonna be torquing bolts down, nothing exciting. When we get done with that, we'll throw our valve covers, our push rods, all that stuff back on, and this engine is pretty much ready to go. Alrighty, so we finished up the install last night of everything. Basically, all we really did was put the oil pan on, new gaskets, heads on, new gaskets, valve covers on, new gaskets, and then we have our belly plate off right now for our hoist lift or our hoist plate. We also did the timing cover, new gasket, new front main seal. Now we're on the back of the engine. We got it on our hoist. We're gonna be removing this flex plate, taking off the rear main, putting a new rear main seal, new gasket, and then installing our flywheel and clutch so we can mount it up to this SM465 transmission. So first thing we gotta do is unbolt these bolts and take this flex plate off. All right, next is our rear engine cover. Stop. See that piece I'm touching right there? Since this is future Jovani, that piece is actually very vital. I recommend replacing that piece. That is the oil barbell as it's known. You'll find out later on in the series why that's important, I think. Just replace that piece. It's cheap. Okay, we're gonna go replace this seal, place the gasket, throw everything back together. Okay, got the cover back on, new gasket, new rear main seal. Next up, we have our flywheel. Actually, I think we have our bushing for here. Now, all of this stuff is GM OEM parts, which is pretty neat because this transmission was never made to mount up to this engine, but there's so many similarities with the small block Chevy that, we kind of make it work. So what this is, I don't have all the correct info right now. I'll put it right here, and if you guys are interested in doing this job and getting these parts, there will be a link to my website where all this stuff will be laid out for you nice and neat. But basically this is a bearing number 6302DU. And what I think this is this is an LS7 rear, input support bearing. I forget what these are called, to be honest. But anyway, that should fit perfectly in there, and it seems like it will, right? On top of that, we're gonna use a NFW 1050 flywheel. I believe this is off of like a heavy duty, probably like a 2500, 3500 early 2000s pickup truck that had, I think, an NV 4500 behind it or an NV 3500. Can't remember specifics again, but all that info is going to be on my website. This is just a GM replacement flywheel. All of these parts in particular I got off of a mix of eBay and Rock Auto, I think. So they're readily available. You can get these at like O'Reilly's, AutoZone, places like that as well. And then our clutch kit, I can't remember what the clutch kit came off of, but we'll figure all that out, and I'll write it right here. But either way, we're gonna get this bearing in here. I'm gonna get this flywheel mounted up, and then we're gonna get our clutch all aligned and installed. All right, beautiful. All right, and then for this, all we have to do is line up all the holes, and then there's one extra hole right in the middle that lines up with that little guy right there. Also got new flywheel bolts. So I'm gonna try to get 1 or 2 bolts started. Trying not to touch the surface because my hands are real dirty right now. So using this plastic bag is kind of our guide, and I'll touch just the ring. Use my knee as a support. Okay. Got 1 bolt in there. Got 1 more. All right, and then we'll send these puppies home. All right, and then we'll torque those down in just a second. After that, all we have to do is mount up our clutch, get everything aligned nice and right, and then we'll go ahead and put this engine back in the Suburban. All right, so that almost just got very interesting. These bolts that I had bought new, I don't think these are the right. I don't know, something about them wasn't right for this application. So we ended up reusing our flex plate bolts. I know, wrong, not supposed to do that, whatever. They torqued down to 74 foot-pounds. These ones I was barely getting like 30 foot-pounds out of before they felt like they were gonna break. So, I don't know, can't explain it, but got it on there, torqued down to 74 foot-pounds with some blue Loctite. Next up is our pressure plate and clutch assembly. That's gonna get torqued down to, I believe, 36 foot-pounds. We'll double check that. But we're gonna clean the surface one more time and then get that puppy aligned and on there. Oh, you know what? I just found out why. I just figured out why. I believe these are the clutch bolts. So, oh well. I have a new bag of them, I guess. Those are fine. They're all the same. These are actually rated higher than those, but whatever. I'm a dummy. Sometimes I make mistakes, just like you guys will too, but at least I'm here making them, so maybe you won't make them as well. I don't know. Anyway, here's our clutch. It's a Exity clutch, and I believe OE clutch kit 04081. Can't remember what it's off of. I think it might be the same as the flex plate, or it's the clutch off of the SM465. But oh, look at that, they gave us a clutch bearing. Wait, this is our throwout bearing, right? Yeah, cool. So we got a new one of those. That's neat. Got our clutch and our pressure plate. Did they give us an alignment tool? Yes, they did. Okay. All right, these things are heavy. Oh God. All right, let's see if we can do this. I haven't done a clutch in a long time. Man, okay, let's try to get this thing on here. There's our 2 pins. Where do those go? Not exactly sure. We'll just wing it, I suppose. Okay. Okay, I see. Okay, so I was struggling with this for a while now. And I remember 2 things, right? None of these parts are supposed to work together. So what we have to do is we have to take our pressure plate and drill out some of the holes. For some reason, some of these holes fit bolts and then the other ones don't. Not sure why. But either way, we're gonna drill out all the holes to accept our bolts. And then we have to actually remove these dowel pins. I don't know if you can remove them with, like, you know, some kind of slide hammer or something. I'm just gonna cut them off. Getting into like the clutch surface that we care about, it's, you know, just a little nick or 2 will work, and just make them flush, and then that should take care of this issue that I've been having. So I'm gonna do that really quickly, cut off those dowel pins, and then our pressure plate should line up and fit on there. Okay, so I sat here for a second kind of pondering how I was gonna get these dowel pins out, and then I realized that there's a hole that goes all the way through. So what we're gonna do is just turn the engine over till we can see that hole on the other side. Is if we could spin this over, we could see the dowel pin hole on the back side and just hammer the dowel pin out. What I did is I just took this Allen key tool, stuck it in the back of the hole, and just gave it a couple little taps. And that seemed to be enough to let it free. I also use this tapered punch first too. There we go. And now this tool, it's hard not to hit yourself. I'm sure we'll get it eventually. Awkward angle. There we go. There it is. That's the dowel removed after all that trouble. That's all it was. So now we can mount our pressure plate up and finish this damn clutch job. All right, so easy peasy. We got this on there. You can see it's a little tight, but slides in pretty well. So that should be able to get our input shaft in there pretty nicely. The trans is still in the car, so it is gonna be kind of a mission to get everything lined up. But you know, we'll just do what we can and see if we can do it. Now I'm gonna go ahead and get this thing kind of hoisted in the engine bay and then kind of get our mounts somewhat situated so we can have a foundation to get everything else done. All right, so that wraps up this episode of Square Repair. Make sure you guys come back for the next video. If you want to make sure you get a notification for that next video, you want to hit that bell button right next to the subscribe button, and also hit that subscribe button so that way you guys can follow along. Once again, I appreciate you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.